Yes.
Hello, good morning, almost good afternoon, everybody. The presentation will start in a few minutes. We are almost ready. Let's wait for all the people to connect. I think it's noon, so it's time to start. So on behalf of our SPE program committee, I would like to welcome you to our technical webinar today with our very special presenter, our distinguished lecturer, Geoff Salter. And now, ahead of the presentation that we are all waiting for, let me go through the few rules that probably by now you all know by heart. So as you know, it's our webinar, so you will not be able to use your microphone or speaking at the video. We will have a Q&A session. It will be as usual at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A button and send us the questions, and then we'll animate the questions in the end of the presentation. Don't hesitate to put your comments into the chat. We will be monitoring the chat because some of you may have some problems, and we'll try to resolve them during the presentation. And of course, as you probably all see, we are recording the presentation, so it will be available later. As usual, a few information what is coming, what's next. So just we are a few days ahead of our CCUS conference, and then in 2 months we will have SPE decommissioning conference in the end of April, and in May 2 events 1 week apart, so seismic and the DevEx conference. Do not hesitate to go to our website to book your participation at these conferences, especially at the CCUS coming just now. It's very important for us that you follow us on different social media, you know, all LinkedIn, Twitters. When you see the messages, like them, share them. It's very important for us to spread the word. So that's a really a very valuable contribution also to our activity. So without further delay, we will move to today's webinar. And we have the honor today to have Geoff Salter, who is a partner at RISC Advisory, specializing in reservoir engineering. And during his nearly 25 years at RISC, he has led technical and due diligence teams on the oil and gas acquisition opportunity all around the world. And today he will share some thoughts with us. Geoff, floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, you all got the screen? All good?
Yes, all good, yes.
Okay, excellent. Right, let me just get my notes up. Okay, yeah, thanks, Maria. And so I'd like to start today's talk by just thanking the SPE Foundation. They were going to pay for me to come to Aberdeen, but unfortunately that got cancelled at the last moment. So I'm sitting here at home on a very hot night here in Perth. Sorry about that, I had to drop that in, all you people in Aberdeen. Okay, so what my talk tonight, today, is about making better upstream acquisitions. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the role of the petroleum engineer in doing technical due diligence. And I'm talking about the sort of acquisitions that many of you may have been involved with in the North Sea. Over more than a decade now, we've seen a gradual transition of asset ownership in the North Sea from the legacy majors to all sorts of smaller companies, and more recently other players as well. I'll talk a little bit about that. So some of you may have done some acquisitions work before. If so, I hope you get something out of this. But if you haven't, what I want to try and get across to you today is a few pointers of how you might go about the role if you were asked to be part of an acquisitions team. And there's really two things I'd like you to take away from today. One is that technical due diligence really matters and it can make a huge difference, and I'll show you some examples. And secondly, that you need to think about it in a different way, to how we all do the day job of, assessing resources and developing resources and maximizing production. And I'll elaborate, how it is different to the day job. And if you ever get the chance to be on an acquisitions team, my advice would be to take it. It's really interesting work. You get to see a lot of different assets. And you also get to see how other people do things in the industry, which can vary a tremendous amount. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about, just going to briefly go through the business of upstream transactions, why people do it. I'm going to talk quite a lot about preparation focus, and I've put those in bold on the slide because those really are so important. And then I'm going to run through some evaluation techniques and give some examples. I'm going to talk about reality checks. When you finish your evaluation, how do you test it to make sure that it's sound? And I'll wrap up with conclusions. So, upstream transactions, business of buying upstream oil and gas assets, is pretty big business. Around about $150 to $200 billion a year of assets change hands. And you can see that's been fairly consistent. There was a big dip in 2020 for obvious reasons. Basically, in the first half of 2020, everything stopped, as we all know. But the market has really roared back to life in the latter part of 2020 and through 2021, and is going very strong at the moment. So some of the driving factors behind acquisitions, companies might go and buy an asset just for growth or to rebalance their portfolio. Very often it's because the original owner requires finance and need to raise some money from somebody else. And increasingly in the last 2 or 3 years, transactions have become transition related. So we can see some of the majors starting to sell some of the more mature, non-core legacy assets, particularly those with a high carbon intensity. And recent themes in the market, buyers are independents. That's been the case for quite a while. Private equity we've seen coming into the market as buyers. The sellers are generally majors. And ESG considerations have become very important to acquirers and form a big part of any acquisition assessment. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking really about the petroleum engineering technical aspects of transactions. I guess this shouldn't be a surprise, but just to emphasize it, oil and gas transactions are different to other company transactions. It's about production. I guess it's quite obvious, but it's worth making the point. Other businesses acquire, merge for market share, synergies, cost reductions, all these sorts of things. Oil and gas companies do that to some extent, but essentially it's about buying production. And it follows directly from that technical due diligence, assessing that production forecast going forward, is absolutely key to both value creation and downside mitigation. So, turning to preparation, I'll dwell quite a bit on this because, as I said before, it's really important. Most sale processes will start with some sort of one-page flyer. That's a little bit of advertising, but it will really get going when you get a copy of the information memorandum, right? And the information memorandum sets out the seller's view of the assets. And very important to remember that the IM is really the seller's case. It's what the seller wants you to put into your economic model and spit out the value that they want. So it's a very useful document, but to be treated with technical critique, I think is the best way of putting it. So preparation, select your team. Ideally, you want people that have been involved with acquisitions before. This is something that requires experience. This is the stage to identify whether you need any external expertise. So there may be issues around the assets that require you to get that external expertise in, carbon sequestration, very large decom costs, those sorts of things. So now's the time to identify whether you need that. Get yourself an economic model. The seller may provide you with one, but if not, people can write you one, or you can purchase one from various service companies. And I'll talk about the need for that at this stage in a moment. And start looking at public domain data. There's a lot of, particularly in the UK, there's a lot of information out there, either public disclosures of public companies or material with the government that will really help you get going and help you to start to ground truth some things in the information memorandum. I certainly like to always look at people's reserve disclosures at an early stage. So continuing with preparation. Right, this may seem too early to be doing this, but I cannot overemphasize the importance of doing this. Having worked in many teams with many different people and bankers and lawyers and accountants, at the earliest possible stage, design the economic input template, because you will save so much time later by having these things worked out. So it's just simple things. What are the product streams you're going to use that are going to go into the economic model? What are the units? Is it barrels a day, millions of barrels a year, meter cubed? What's the effective date? Are we working annual, quarterly, monthly? Are we going to work in gross or net? And by what fields and blocks and a cost real or nominal? All these things. Get it sorted at the beginning. Agree the template with the team and other advisors, the banks if they're involved, and you will save enormous amounts of time later on messing around with converting, at quarterly forecasts to annual, etc. So turning now to data rooms. So data rooms are physical and or virtual. Clearly in the last year or so, they've been virtual. But this graphic still applies to the virtual space, because what you get is a very large collection of documents. Could be up to the order of 10,000 for a big transaction. And you've got to make sense of that. And it has to be said that most data rooms make the buyer work pretty hard in order to understand the seller's case. It shouldn't be like that, but it is the case. Most of them are incomplete, because you'll get stuck into it and find information that isn't there. And the Q&A process tends to be slower than you would like. We very often find that the answers to the questions start arriving just about when you're completing your assessment. And a separate point here, but it's been difficult recently, obviously, because everything's been virtual, but physical data rooms do provide an invaluable opportunity to meet the seller's staff. And I don't know whether any of you have had an experience of this, but I've found over the years you can learn so much more by sitting down with somebody face to face, getting them to take you through the work they've done, their reservoir model or their decline curve analysis or whatever. And it's something that is difficult to do in the current environment, but not impossible. Something that's becoming quite popular now is something called the virtual physical data room, which you may have come across this, but it's basically where you see the models, somebody's simulation or geological models on a server, and you have the person that created it on a permanent Zoom line or Teams or whatever, so that you can talk to them as you go through it. And that works pretty well. But I'd still say that when this is all over, if you get the chance to do it physically, go and meet the people. So I'm going to turn now from preparation to focus. And focus is really important. There is you're probably going to have about 3 weeks or so to do the technical assessment of an asset. And there is no way that you can recreate the last 10 years of technical work that the seller has done. So you're going to have to focus on what really matters. And something we like to do, don't always do it, but something we like to do is at a very early stage, using the inputs from the information memorandum, put it into the economic model that I just mentioned you should get, and run this sort of sensitivity chart to try and get an early idea of what makes this asset tick. What is it sensitive to? And this sort of chart gives you a very clear visual idea. And you can start to play with the numbers and get a feel for it. So that's something really useful to do right up front. The other thing you can do up front is identify the key reservoirs and identify the key issues. Identify the key reservoirs because you're not going to be able to go through everything. You're going to have to decide early on what to look at. Most assets, in my experience, follow some sort of 80-20 rule, as do most things in the industry. And 20% of the reservoirs, for example, provide 80% of the resources. And now's a good time also to start thinking about what are the real issues and identify flags, we often call them. So most companies have some sort of system with a different ranking of issues. So a red flag means stop now. This asset's not going to work for us. Let's go and look at something else. And then there's various other colors that helps you grade what the issues might be. Very useful process upfront in order to provide focus. And this is a point I'll probably come back to. It's, in my opinion, it's much better to dig deep in a few areas than just, run a rough finger over everything. And we'll come back to that. So, continuing with focus, now's also the time to think about deliverables. This may seem early and we haven't done any analysis yet, but again, thinking about the deliverables at this stage will focus the whole team on what they're going to look at and what they're going to deliver. And my preference is to generate something like this that involves a series of specific cases that you're going to run through the economic model. I prefer to do specific cases like this because I think it much better identifies, conveys uncertainty in value to the decision maker, rather than what we sometimes do in the industry, which is just calculate an economic value and then make a spider plot. And thinking it through in terms of generating these scenarios, make sure everybody is being internally consistent and avoids compounding upsides and downsides. And there's really no need to anchor your evaluation in terms of the normal reserves or resource categories. You often see people do this, but you don't have to do this. You may need to do it because there may be a bank involved and the bank wants reserves that meet their lending criteria. It may be the buyer wants to know an estimate of what reserves they can book. But this is an opportunity to be free of those constraints and look at things that really matter to the economic uncertainty of the asset. So I'm going to turn now to talk about the approach that you take. In other words, you've got these 10,000 documents, how are you going to tackle your assessment? You've got 3 weeks to do it, how are you going to do it? So this is the typical industry workflow, what I call bottom up. We start with basic data, logs, core, tests, etc. We estimate volumes in place. I won't go through all this, but we end up with a forecast of production. We make some cost estimates, and we end up with an economic value. Right? That's generally what we as petroleum engineers get involved with in this industry. And that period for any sort of sizable asset, a big offshore oil field, will take months. So the due diligence workflow is almost the opposite. As I indicated earlier, I think it's good practice to start with the economics, to start with running some economic sensitivities to see what makes it tick. And that will help you focus on where you're going to go and audit. Which production and cost forecasts you're going to go and look at in detail. So the next stage is to find the source of those, let's say, production forecasts. Maybe they come from a reservoir model. Okay, let's go back, let's find that reservoir model. Go back down to that. Let's look in the reservoir model. What's important in the reservoir model? Okay, it's maybe some assumption on connectivity. Okay, let's go and look at the DSTs. It may be assumptions on the PVT. Okay, let's go and look at the PVT. So it's only at the end of this process that you go back to the basic data where you need to. And of necessity, this process has to take weeks. And I'd argue that really doing it top down like this is the only way you can do the sort of work that needs to be done in the typical 3 to 4 weeks that you get to do it. So turning to evaluation techniques, there's many different ways of doing things in the industry. We're all familiar with the geoscience, geo model, reservoir model, economic sort of progression. But for example, if you were faced with this is a real example, fully developed field in Asia. Does this fully developed field need any geoscience? I'd say probably not. Yeah, that's a pretty good decline curve, as good as you can get. But you might want to understand what some of these shutdowns, what's causing some of these shutdowns. So continuing with evaluation techniques, this is the typical resource progression that in the ideal world, we go from a wide range of resources at the exploration stage to very low uncertainty late in life, in theory. We don't always. And the data available changes clearly. At the beginning, you've only got seismic data, and at the end, you've got production data. So the kind of data you're going to have very much depends on the asset maturity. And therefore, the techniques you're going to use are very much going to depend on that asset maturity. So again, at the beginning, seismic analogs are going to be your tools. At the end, we're material balance and decline curve analysis. Most things are somewhat in the middle, so we probably have to do a bit of everything. But the point I'm trying to make is that your evaluation techniques needs to reflect the maturity of the asset. So turning to geoscience, data evaluation, this is very general, but very often it's the gross rock volume that's the biggest uncertainty in volumetrics. I'm sure we've all seen this. So clearly it would be rare that you didn't have a look at the seismic and the basis for that gross rock volume. And you'd be looking at things like whether the attribute story is sound, are the attributes calibrated. I'm just going to skip through this quite quickly and then get to some examples. Petrophysics, sometimes can be a big issue, sometimes not a big issue. At the very least, you want to quality check the method that the sellers used, run a few spot checks. In the situation where it's really important, you might want to rerun it. Cutoffs is a favorite subject. That's the subject of a completely different presentation, but it is well worth looking at cutoffs that are being used in petrophysics, and particularly the cutoffs, the consistency of cutoff applications in defining net reservoir, net pay, as you go through geological models into reservoir models. So what to do about static models? Very typically these days, any sort of sizable asset you'll get given or at least access to online a static model. It'll be tens, hundreds of thousands of cells, probably very typically, in fact, undocumented, other than a few view graphs for management. No report into how it was set up. Hopefully you've got access to the person that set it up, but sometimes not. What are you going to do with it? It's quite a difficult beast to actually look at and say, and do the checks and say, I agree with this or I don't agree with this. Obviously, your geoscientist is going to do the obvious checks. The surfaces agree, the rock properties agree with the well logs. A simple check, I think it would be fair to say we always do, is just to back out from the geological model, static model, what is the model average net to gross, probably by zone, average porosity and saturations, and compare that to the averages generated from well logs. And I'll show you an example in a moment of where that proved to be pretty useful. And then do a quick look check of oil or gas in place using an alternative method, a simpler method. So this is the first of a number of case studies I've got that hopefully will illustrate the points I'm trying to make. So this is a case where the cellar volumetrics were too high. So we identified this by doing what I just said. We backed out the average properties from the model. And in this particular case, it turned out that the net gross of them in the static model was considerably higher than that derived from the well averages. And so we made a map out of the static model of net gross and posted the wells on it. And you can see immediately that the wells have apparently been drilled in the wrong place, that there's maxima of net gross between them here and to the south. This is a real example, and clearly that there's a degree of bias in that in that static model. We didn't believe it. We recommended our client not proceed with this deal, and they didn't proceed with it. And I looked up the production of this field the other day. This would have been about 10 or 15 years ago. So I looked up the production from public domain sources, and this was the forecast at the time of the field development plan was lodged, and this is what it actually did. So I think really a good example of how static models can be need checking. So I'm turning now to reservoir data evaluation, by which I really mean reservoir engineering kind of data. And for producing assets, the old techniques of decline curve analysis and material balance are your friend in this sort of business, because they're quick and they can be pretty accurate. Here's a case, this real case again, gas field. We're presented with a full field model. That was the forecast. 10-minute job to set up a spreadsheet with, this was good permeability gas reservoir, should obey the material balance requirements. 10-minute job, spreadsheet, looks pretty good. That's a quick way of doing a check without even going into the full detail of that model. And then I won't go into this in detail, but for non-producing assets, clearly you can't use decline curve or material balance. You've got to use some of the other older classical techniques of water flood analysis, but that's another subject. I won't go into that. I would say, as a reservoir engineer, always look at the well tests, or DSTs, or production tests. And particularly you're looking for any indications either in the report or in the charts of depletion or boundaries. I can't think how many times you get the story from the seller, you get the models, and they're all nice and pretty, and then you go and look in the well test reports and you find little things about boundaries that have not made its way into the reservoir models. And RFTs or MDTs, also well worth looking at in detail. What you'll often get presented by the seller is very filtered data in A4 plots, and you can't really see the detail of what's going on. It's important to go in and look at the detail and make sure that what is being shown is realistic. So turning to reservoir models now, or dynamic models, what are we going to do? We're not going to rebuild the model. We can't look at every cell. We've got to take some approaches to convince ourselves that this model is a sound basis for production forecasting, and I'm prepared to buy that production forecast. So sort of things you can do. I mean, obviously, if there's history, you can look at the history match method, how they got to the history match, and the quality of the history match. It's a reasonable indicator, although I think as most reservoir engineers know, you can get a very good history match by a very poor method. So it's very important to look at the method as well as the quality of the match. compare it with decline curves. Something that I like to do is to ask a seller to run their economic model, to run their dynamic model in with no further activity in order to extract a decline curve from the model. I'll show you an example of this in a moment. You generally won't have that run presented to you by the seller, because the seller will be trying to say that, you know, there's potential for another 10 wells and numerous zone changes, and, you know, here's a lovely forecast. But if you ask them to just switch off all the further development activities and run a no further activity forecast, you've got something that you can line up with the with periods of no development during the decline curve. And it's a very good test, and I'll show you an example in a moment. Residual saturations, really important if it's water flood or gas flood. The well controls and constraints, surprisingly, are often a big factor in the actual outcome. Is downtime in there? Have the lift curves been put in? You very frequently see models without lift curves and just on some bottom hole pressure assumptions. PVT and aquifers, clearly. These are the sorts of things you can check fairly quickly by looking at the model. So here's my second case study, and so this is quite a large offshore oil field in West Africa, operated by a major, and that was broadly in very simple terms, the production history. So I plotted log oil rate against cumulative oil. So it's roughly following a harmonic decline trend, broadly. There's some bits of development here, but then you can see bits of decline. So as I was saying on the previous slide, we asked the seller to run this as a developed only case. In other words, no further activity. And that was the result from their model. And I think, yeah, it's obvious that that model, just from that plot, could be suspect. And there was a lot of discussion about this. That's a more reasonable line and decline curve through the data. And we entered into extensive discussions with the seller over the technical merit of this, largely convinced them that the blue line, this line here, was probably more convincing. And as a result of that very long meeting, our client, the buyer, managed to get $200 million off the NPV. And this deal was done. So that was real money. So a very, I think, convincing example of the benefit of doing some fairly simple checks with a reservoir model. And here's another way of dealing with reservoir models. So again, this is using decline curves to check the incremental recovery from infill drilling. So what I've done here is take the production data, segment it into the production from wells drilled in various broadly annual campaigns. So we've made a decline here really to try and reflect the benefit of every annual campaign over the last 5 or 6 years. And you can see that each annual campaign is broadly adding reserves rather than accelerating. So you can take that plot and then put it into time like this. And you know, this is, so we've got here the annual incremental oil added per well in the blue. And I'm comparing it to what the seller is claiming from their phase 1 and phase 2 infill drilling campaigns. And you know, this is an example where I think you can say from that plot, yeah, I've done a quick check and broadly, the claims look reasonable. Phase 1 and phase 2 are adding reserves per well, similar, consistent with some of the historical performance. It's not going to be your only check, but it's giving you some confidence that the model is reasonable. Okay, and here's another case study. So this is a gas field, and in this case, the seller's gas reserves. This was a listed company, and these reserves were booked. This is a real case, and this was their actual 1P and 2P interpretation, which on the face of it looks okay. So they're using material balance, simple P over Z plot, and the 2P is kind of an average line through all the data points, and the 1P here in the blue is a conservative, a more conservative representation of that. And then they've assigned reserves based on depletion down to some reservoir abandonment pressure down here. Okay, so closer look at that revealed the possibility of some degree of water drive. And a better, in my view, interpretation of this data revealed this, that you could match this data with a whole range of combinations of gas in place and aquifer. And this is what we actually came up with as an alternative 1P, 2P, and 3P case. And I think you can see two things on here. One is the data match really well. In fact, there is a little bit of curve in this data, consistent with a water drive gas field. And two, that the 2P and 1P are way, way lower than what the operator had booked. And I think I did mention this is a listed company. In fact, even the 3P in this interpretation, because there's clear evidence of some water movement, is lower than their 2P. So it's a good example of looking for alternative explanations and looking at the data closely and well. Okay, upside. Mustn't forget to look for upside. The whole purpose of doing the deal is to pay something for the production and then add value by increasing the production. It's very, very, very easy to be conservative in these sorts of evaluations. The data set you get is not always perfect. You don't have enough time to fully understand it. And faced with uncertainty, people tend to discount. The problem is if the geoscientist takes 10% off, and the petrophysicist takes 10% off, and the reservoir engineer takes 10% off, and the costs person adds 10%, you're never going to do any deals because the compounded impact is enormous. So you've got to avoid being too conservative. And in looking for upside, one of the simple ways of trying to get an impression of whether there might be upside is just to look at trends. What have oil in place or gas in place or reserves been doing over time? And here's an example where this was a gas field. It's generally been increasing for various reasons as more data has been gathered. And that's usually, in my experience, quite a good sign. And in this case, we felt there was a further increase was due. So for upside, mature non-core fields are often very good targets. And I say non-core because what you're hoping here is that the seller hasn't given it the attention that they've given to their core fields, and that opportunities have not been discovered, not met their screening criteria or whatever, and there's good opportunities there. And I mean, there's numerous examples in the North Sea where new operators have taken over majors' legacy assets and made very impressive gains in resources and value. And what you're really trying to do here is find value that someone else cannot. And you're going to have to do that by either being cleverer than them, having a better team, or having better technology, or maybe more regional expertise. Regional expertise can be really useful in this business. Okay, so just turning to costs now, which will clearly form an important part of any acquisition assessment. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but I think it's always useful to look at plots like this. This is a survey of several 200 projects, I think, and the 0% line is where there was no cost change from the original budget when it went to project sanction or FID. And you can see there's tremendous bias over here to projects that are overrun. So are the project team, if it's an undeveloped asset, are they really being honest with themselves that they can deliver this project at that cost? Benchmarks and analogs are really useful. Can be hard to get, but there is data out there if you know where to look. Are your cost and price forecasts consistent? So by that I mean, when you, we've all seen how prices in the industry, rig prices, contractor prices, increase when oil prices are high, and they decrease when oil prices are low. So you need to keep that consistency in your evaluation if you're using, if you're doing oil price sensitivities. And have contingencies been applied appropriately and consistently? Often very large differences in how contingencies are applied to different components of the costs. So those are the sorts of things your facilities engineer will probably be looking at. Mature asset issues, specifically, a lot of assets for sale are mature. Integrity and operability are absolutely key, absolutely fundamental issue in the North Sea, as is decom. The cost of decom, as we know, can be the major value driver for late life projects. What we often see, unless decommissioning is imminent, is that whilst every other cost estimate may be to a high degree of accuracy, the decommissioning cost estimate is only at a relatively inaccurate screening level. So when it's the major value driver, that needs to be looked at closely, and I think is often a case for getting in specific expertise. Site visits, very useful if you get the chance. And I'm going to turn now to my last case study. So this is a situation where it was actually facilities issues that drove reserves in value. So this is a mature offshore gas field with a future planned compression and well. And we did our developed analysis. I think it was probably a reasonable material balance model. Developed reserves fairly well defined. A little bit of uncertainty with the planned compression and development well, but even so, not a huge range of ultimate recovery. We then overlaid on that some uncertainty in the plant operability range, and that was the impact on gas ultimate recovery. So this is a case where it's actually facilities issues that are driving not only reserves, but value, clearly. So finally, step back from your work. Often hard to do because you've probably worked overtime and weekends to deliver the results in the short time frame you've got. But at some point, you've got to step back and try and do some reality checks. And so something I like to do, if the data is available, and if you look for it, it often is, particularly with companies, public companies, they will have issued reserve reports going back 10, 15 years in annual reports, or just ask them for the data. They'll have internal reserves assessments going back that far. And look at the history of annual reserve additions. And you might get something like this. So this operator's been adding between 0 and 20, I don't know what the unit is, million barrels each year. That's what they've been achieving with, that's what that team has been achieving with that asset. So in this example, I then took what was put into the information memorandum and translated that as conversions from 2C contingent resources to 2P reserves. And that was the projection of what they expected to happen over the next 5 years. And I think it's a very simple check that you can see that that projection of conversions from 2C to 2P, in other words, reserve additions, is probably optimistic. And there's many other checks you can do, but and I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but clearly unit costs is a simple one. Look at the history, look at what's being forecast and compare them. So winding up, my conclusions. Acquisition due diligence requires the reverse approach to the upstream workflow, top down. You need to start with the economics, work out what makes it tick, and then work down to those models and that data that need looking at. There's great insight to be had from personal interaction with Stella's staff. Hard to do at the moment, but hopefully we'll get back to normal soon. In my view, it's always better to dig deep into a few key areas and really examine the models or the seismic or whatever, the costs, than to just scratch the surface. Prepare credible, coherent, specific cases in order to convey uncertainty to your decision maker, typically a management team or board. Don't forget to look for upside as well as the downsides. Step back and reality check, and dedicated M&A technical teams do it best. And it pays. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geoff. I'm just checking if we have the Q&A. No questions. I have personally one question, because usually I'm sitting on this other side, surrounded by all the financial consultants of all the Deloittes or KPMGs of the world. And I'm just wondering how the interaction between this group happens, at what stage, how it's in the practical way organized.
You're talking about
during an M&A process, yes.
Between technical team and the legal team and the accounting
and the finance
team.
Yes.
Yeah, finance and that's a really good point. I think the reality is it probably doesn't happen as well as it could do these days. We all love Teams and Zoom, but it's not the same as being thrown together in a hotel in a foreign city for a week. My experience is when you get everybody together away from their offices, you get a lot more interaction between the teams, between the disciplines, than you ever do just doing it online. And it's really important. And what is really, really useful is to have people that have enough breadth of knowledge such that when you as an engineer spot something that is material to the financial people or the legal people, perhaps a legacy claim that just happens to be in one of the TCMs or the documents, is to point it out to the legal people and get them to point things out to you that they come across. It's stuff that is in gas sales contracts. We I personally hate looking at gas sales contracts and not qualified, but there are often things in there that are pretty relevant to reservoir engineers that they need to know. So it's really important what you highlight there, and I would say it often doesn't happen well enough. I think having a really good acquisition team leader makes it happen, because he or she will have that overview, that breadth of knowledge to try and see cross-discipline issues. Does that answer your question, Maria?
It's a teamwork, it's really a teamwork.
Absolutely. Yeah,
so that's what's reassuring, that it's still a very important value. I have a question from Jean-François Roux. What do you think about probabilistic approach, including subsurface uncertainties as well as surface ones, planning's costs?
Absolutely, yeah. I was brought up in the North Sea, and I was brought up doing probabilistics. So
definitely yes.
We do probabilistics, yeah. I don't think probabilistic economic modeling really works. I've seen it attempted. I don't know if this is where your question was going, but probabilistics for volumes, probabilistics for costs, great. But when it comes to economic modeling, in my experience, if you do it probabilistically, you just get a cloud of that you don't really understand. And I really like doing specific scenarios for economics, as I was saying. Possibly you could do both. I think, as has been said many times in the industry, a combination approach of probabilistic and deterministic volumetrics probably gives you more insight into the range than just doing one approach. But yeah, absolutely happy to do probabilistics.
And we have also a question if it's worth running dynamic models as part of due deal, or just discuss it with to the seller's engineers.
I think it's worth running your own cases. Yeah, practically, in my experience, it's pretty hard to you often don't get the actual model, so you can't have it on your own laptop and run it on your own software. But you often get terminal server access and can run cases. My preference is to actually ask the seller to run the cases, because if it's any sort of major, they've got some pretty fast hardware, and the person that has set up the models can run cases quicker than I could, certainly quicker than I could. And my preference is to get them to run cases. As I said, a favorite of mine is to run that no further activity case and just do a simple check against some decline curve if there's past production history. But I would very much advocate doing running your own cases and getting a feel for it. Yeah, you can learn a lot from it.
I think it was very interesting when you shared really the cases and how the situation then evolved. I really found it extremely interesting. We rarely have this after, because we run our models, we are in it, and then 10 years later, it was really interesting what you showed. And last question.
There is a downside to it.
Yeah.
The downside would be that you signal, of course, your hand. You signal to the seller something that you're thinking. So, for example, if you have a really good idea about how you can get some more resources out of the field, and you get them to run the case, and they see, oh, actually there's a 10, 20 million barrel opportunity here, then they're going to factor that into their negotiation, because they can see what you're looking at. So in that case, you might want to run your own if you can get hold of the data files. But otherwise, always run your own cases, yeah.
And to finish, I have a very, very tricky question for you. In your experience, which sellers are most honest? Independents, majors, small or large companies? What is your opinion, Geoff, to conclude our webinar?
That's a good, I've not been asked that one before. Hang on, what's the choice? Independents, majors. What was the choice? Independents, majors?
Small and large. You take them all. You take them all.
Not small. Not small. I think I don't think it's so much a question of honesty. I wouldn't use the word honesty, but I would say small companies can be, this is being diplomatic, can be a glass half full, and large companies often, people don't want to stick their neck out, so there's often some conservatism built in, and acquisitions from large companies are often good business. As I said, if it's non-core, there's often opportunities to be had. So it's a great generalization, but that's what I'd say.
Thank you very much still for giving us the answer to this question. Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your thoughts, and especially, if I may say, the case studies. Extremely rich, and that will conclude our webinar today. Thank you all participants, all those who participated and put the questions and were with us. Do not hesitate to join us again and comment on the social media. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Maria. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.